Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be reading some Kant. We're going to be reading the Prolegoma. I just need to plug in my laptop one moment. So the Prolegoma is basically how Kant is outlining, in a brief way, what happens in the Critique of Pure Reason. And he goes into his answering of David Hume. So, Prolegoma to Any Future Metaphysics by Immanuel Kant, 1783. Okay, let's go. The introduction. These Prolegoma are destined for the use not of pupils, but of future teachers, and even the latter should not expect that they will be serviceable for the systematic exposition of a ready-made science, but merely for the discovery of the science itself. These are scholarly men to whom the history of philosophy, both ancient and modern, is philosophy itself. For these, the present Prolegoma are not written. They must wait till those who endeavour to draw from the fountain of reason itself have completed their work. It will then be the historian's turn to inform the world of what has been done. Unfortunately, nothing can be said which, in their opinion, has not been said before. And truly the same prophecy applies to all future time. For since the human reason has for many centuries speculated upon innumerable objects in various ways, it is hardly to be expected that we should not be able to discover an analogy for every new idea among the old sayings of the past. My object is to persuade all those who think metaphysics worth studying that it is absolutely necessary to pause a moment and neglecting all that has been done, to pose first the preliminary question: what such a metaphysics, as whether such a metaphysics be at all possible. If it be a science, how comes it cannot, like other sciences, obtain universal and permanent recognition? If not, how can it maintain its pretensions and keep the human mind in suspense with hopes, never ceasing, yet never fulfilled? Whether then we demonstrate our knowledge of our ignorance in this field, we must come once for all to a definitive conclusion respecting the nature of this so-called science, which cannot possibly remain on its present footing. It seems almost ridiculous, while every other science is continually advancing, that in this, which pretends to be wisdom, incarnate for those oracle every one inquires, we should constantly move round the same spot without gaining a single step. And so its followers having melted away, we do not find men confident of their ability to shine in other sciences, venturing their reputation here, where everyone, however ignorant in other matters, may deliver a final verdict. As in this domain, there is yet no standard weight and measure to distinguish sound knowledge from shallow talk. After all, it is nothing extraordinary in the elaboration of a science, when men begin to wonder how far it has advanced, that the question should at least occur whether and how such a science is possible. Human reason so delights in constructions that it has several times built up a tower and then raised it to examine the nature of the foundation. It is never too late to become wise, but if the change comes late, there is always more difficulty in starting a reform. The question whether a science is possible presupposes a doubt as to its actuality, but such a doubt offends the men whose whole possession consists of this supposed duel. Hence, he who raises the doubt must expect opposition from all sides, some in the proud consciousness of their possession, which are ancient and therefore considered legitimate, will take their metaphysical compendia in their hands and look down on him with contempt. Others, who never see anything except it be identical with what they have seen before, will not understand him, and everything will remain for a time as if nothing had happened, to excite the concern or the hope for an impending change. Nevertheless, I venture to predict that the independent reader of these Prolegoma will not only doubt his previous science, but ultimately be fully persuaded that it cannot exist unless the demands here stated on which its possibility depends be satisfied. And as this has never been done, that there is as yet no such thing as metaphysics, but as it can never cease to be in demand, since the interests of common sense are intimately interwoven with it. He must confess that a radical reform, or rather a new birth of the science after an original plan, are unavoidable, however men may struggle against it for a while. Since the essay of Locke and Leibniz, or rather, since the origin of metaphysics so far as we have known its history, nothing has ever happened which was more decisive to its faith than the attack upon it by David Hume. He threw no light on this species of knowledge, but he certainly struck a spark from which light might have been obtained, had it caught some inflammable substance and had its smouldering fire been carefully nursed and developed. Hume started from a single but important concept of metaphysics, cause and effect, including its derivatives, force and action. He challenges reason, which pretends to have given birth to this idea from herself, to answer him by what right she thinks anything to be so constituted that if that thing has posited something else also must necessarily be posited, for this is the meaning of the concept cause. He demonstrated irrefutably that it was perfectly impossible to reason, to think a priori, and by means of concepts, a combination involving necessity. We cannot at all see why, in consequence of the existence of one thing, another must necessarily exist, or how the concept of such a combination can arise a priori. Hence he inferred that reason was altogether deluded with reference to this concept, which she erroneously considered as one of her children, whereas in reality it was nothing but a bastard of the imagination, impregnated by experience, which assumed certain representations under the law of association, and mistook the subjective necessity of habit for an objective necessity arising from insight. Hence, he inferred that reason had no power to think such combinations, even generally, because her concepts would then be purely fictitious, and all her pretended a priori cognitions nothing but common experience marked with a false stamp. In plain language, there is not, and cannot be, any such thing as metaphysics at all. However hasty and mistaken Hume's conclusion may appear, it was at least founded upon investigation, and this investigation deserved the concentrated attention of the brighter spirits of his day, as well as a determined effort on their part to discover, if possible, a happier solution to the problem in the sense proposed by him, all of which would have speedily resulted in a complete reform of science. So what's the footnote? Okay. In plain language, there is not and cannot be any such thing as metaphysics at all. Nevertheless, Hume called this very destructive science metaphysics and attached to it great value, Metaphysics and morals, he declares in his fourth part of his essay, are the most important branches of science. Metaphysics and physics are not nearly so important. But the acute man merely regarded the negative views arising from the moderation of extravagant claims of speculative reason and the complete settlement of many endless and troublesome controversies that misled mankind. He overlooked the positive injury which results if reason be deprived of its most important prospect, which can alone supply to the will the highest aim of all its endeavours. Okay. But Hume suffered the usual misfortune of metaphysics of not being understood. It was positively painful to see how utterly his opponents Reid, Oswald, Beattie, and lastly Priestley missed the point of the problem. For while they were ever taking for granted that which he doubted, and demonstrating with zeal and often with impotence that which he never thought of doubting, they so misconstrued his valuable suggestion that everything remained in its old condition, as if nothing had happened. The question was not whether the concept of cause was right, useful, and even indispensable for our knowledge of nature, for this Hume had never doubted, but whether that concept could be thought by reason a priori, and consequently, whether it possessed an inner truth independent of all experience, implying a wider application than merely to the objects of experience. This was Hume's problem. It was a question concerning the origin, not concerning the indispensable need of the concept. Were the former decided, the conditions of the use and the sphere of its valid application would have been determined as a matter of course. But to satisfy the conditions of the problem, the opponents of the great thinker should have penetrated very deeply into the nature of reason, so far as it is concerned with pure thinking, a task which did not suit them. They found a more convenient method of being defined without any insight, vis-a-vis the appeal to common sense. It is indeed a great gift of God to possess right, or, as they now call it, plain common sense. But this common sense must be shown practically by well-considered and reasonable thoughts and words, not by appealing to it as an oracle, when no rational justification can be advanced. The appeal to common sense when insight and science fail, and no sooner, this is one of the subtle discoveries of modern times, by means of which the most superficial ranter can safely enter the lists with the most thoughtful, thorough thinkers, and hold his own. But as long as a particle of insight remains, no one would think of having recourse to this subterfuge. For what is it but an appeal to the opinion of the multitude, of whose applause the philosopher is ashamed, while the popular charlatan glories and confines in it? I should think that Hume might fairly have laid as much claim to common sense as Beattie, and in addition to critical reason, such as the latter did not possess, which keeps common sense in check and prevents it from speculating, or if speculations are under discussion, restrains the desire to decide, because it cannot satisfy itself concerning its own arguments. By this means alone can common sense remain sound. Chisels and hammers may suffice to work a piece of wood, but for steel engraving we require an engraver's needle. Thus common sense and speculative understanding are each serviceable in their own way. The former in judgments which apply immediately to experience, the latter when we judge universally from mere concepts, as in metaphysics, were sound common sense, so called in spite of the inapplicability of the word, has no right to judge at all. I openly confess the suggestion of David Hume was the very thing which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber, and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy quite a new direction. I was far from following him in the conclusion at which he arrived by regarding not the whole of his problem, but a part which by itself can give us no information. If we start from a well-founded but undeveloped thought, which another has bequeathed to us, we may well hope to continue reflection to advance farther than the acute man to whom we owe the first spark of light. I therefore first tried whether Hume's objection could not be put into a general form, and soon found that the concept of the connection of cause and effect was by no means the only idea by which the understanding thinks the connection of things a priori, but rather that metaphysics consists altogether of such connections. I sought to ascertain their number, and when I had satisfactorily succeeded in this by starting from a single principle, I proceeded to the deduction of these concepts, which I was now certain were not deduced from experience. As Hume had apprehended, but sprang from the pure understanding, this deduction, which seemed impossible to my acute predecessor, which had never even occupied to anyone else, though no one had hesitated to use the concepts without investigating the basis of their objective validity, was the most difficult task ever undertaken in the service of metaphysics. And the worst was that metaphysics, such as it then existed, could not assist me in the least, because this deduction alone can render metaphysics possible. But as soon as I had succeeded in solving Hume's problem, not merely in particular case, but with respect to the whole sphere of pure reason completely, and from general principles, in his circumstance as well as in its contents, this was required for metaphysics in order to construct its system according to a reliable method. But I fear that the execution of Hume's problem, in its widest extent, vis-a-vis my critique of pure reason, will fare as the problem itself fared when first proposed. It will be misjudged because it is misunderstood, and misunderstood because men choose to skim through the book and not to think through it. A disagreeable task, because the work is dry, obscure, opposed to all ordinary notions, and moreover long-winded. I confess, however, I did not expect to hear from philosophers complain of want of popularity, entertainment, and facility, when the existence of a highly prized and indispensable cognition is at stake, which cannot yet established otherwise than by the strictest of rule of methodic precision. Popularity may follow, but is inadmissible in the beginning. Yet, as regards a certain obscurity arising partly from the diffuseness of the plan, owing to which the principal points of the investigation are easily lost sight of, the complaint is just, and I intend to remove it by the present Prolegoma. The first mentioned work, which discusses the pure faculty of reason in its whole compass and bounds, will remain the foundation to which the Prolegoma as a preliminary exercise refer, for our critique must first be established as a complete and perfected science before we can think of letting metaphysics appear on the scene, or even have the most distant hope of attaining it. We have been long accustomed to seeing antiquated knowledge produced as new by taking it out of its former context and reducing it to system in a new suit of any fancy pattern under the new titles. Most readers will set out by expecting nothing else from the critique, but these Prolegoma may persuade him that it is perfectly new science, of which no one has ever even thought, the very idea of which was unknown, and for which nothing hitherto accomplished can be of the smallest use, except it be the suggestion of Hume's doubts. Yet even he did not suspect such a formal science, but ran his ship ashore, for safety's sake, landing on skepticism, there to let it lie and rot, whereas my object is rather to give it a pilot, who by means of safe astronomical principles drawn from a knowledge of the globe and provided with a complete chart and compass may steer the ship safely whither he listen. If in a new science, which is wholly isolated and unique in its kind, we started with the prejudice that we can judge of things by means of our previously acquired knowledge, which is previously what has first to be called in question, we should only fancy we saw everywhere what we had already known, the expressions having a similar sound, only that all would appear utterly metamorphosed, senseless, and unintelligible, because we should have as a foundation our own notions, made by long habit a second nature instead of the author's. But the long-windedness of the work, so far as it depends on the subject and not the exposition, its consequent, unavoidable dryness, and its scholastic precision, are qualities which can only benefit the science, though they may discredit the book. Few writers are gifted with the subtlety and at the same time with the grace of David Hume, or with the depth as well as the elegance of Moses Mendelssohn. Yet I flatter myself I might have made my own exposition popular had my object been merely to sketch out a plan and leave its completion to others, instead of having my heart in the welfare of the science to which I had devoted myself so long. In truth, it requires no little constancy, and even self-denial to postpone the sweets of an immediate success to the prospect of the slower but more lasting reputation. Making plans is often the occupation of an opulent and boastful mind, which thus obtains the reputation of a creative genius, but demanding what it cannot supply itself, by censoring what it cannot improve, and by proposing what it knows not where to find. And yet something more should belong to a sound plan of a general critique of pure reason than mere conjectures. If this plan is to be other than the usual declamations of pious aspirations, but pure reason is a sphere so separate and so self-contained that we cannot touch a part without affecting all the rest. We can therefore do nothing without first determining the position of each part and its relation to the rest. For as our judgment cannot be corrected by anything without the validity and use of every part depends upon the relation in which it stands to all the rest within the domain of reason. So in the structure of an organized body, the end of each member can only be deduced from the full conception of the whole. It may then be said of such a critique that it is never trustworthy except it be perfectly complete down to the smallest elements of pure reason. In the sphere of this faculty, you can determine either everything or nothing. But although a mere sketch preceding the critique of pure reason would be unintelligible, unreliable, and useless, it is all the more useful as a sequel. For so we are able to grasp the whole, to examine in detail the chief points of importance in the science, and to improve in many respects our exposition as compared with the first execution of the work. After the completion of the work, I offer here such a plan which is sketched out after an analytical method. While the work itself had to be executed in the synthetical style, in order that the science may present all its articulations as the structure of a particular cognitive faculty in their natural combination. But should any reader find this plan which I publish in the Prolegoma to any future metaphysics still obscure, let him consider that not everyone is bound to study metaphysics, that many minds will succeed very well in the exact and even in deep sciences, more closely allied to practical experience, while they cannot succeed in investigations dealing exclusively with abstract concepts. In such cases, men should apply their talents to other subjects, but he who undertakes to judge, or still more to construct a system of metaphysics, must satisfy and demand here made either by adopting my solution or by thoroughly refuting it and substituting another. To evade it is impossible. In conclusion, let it be remembered that this much abused obscurity, frequently serving as a mere pretext under which people hide their own indolence and dullness, has its uses, since all who in other sciences observe a judicious silence, speak authoritatively in metaphysics, and make bold decisions because their ignorance is not here contrasted with the knowledge of others. Yet it does contrast with sound critical principles, which we may therefore commend in the words of Virgil. Ignavum focus pecus e praesipibus arcent. These are defending their hives against drones, those indolent creatures. Prolegoma, preamble on the peculiarities of metaphysical cognition. 1. Of the sources of metaphysics. If it becomes desirable to formulate any cognition as science, it will be necessary first to determine accurately those peculiar features which no other science has in common with it, constituting its characteristics. Otherwise, the boundaries of all science become confused, and none of them can be treated thoroughly according to its nature. The characteristics of science may consist in a simple difference of object or of the sources of cognition, or the kind of cognition, or perhaps all the three conjointly. On this, therefore, depends the idea of a possible science and its territory. First, as concerns the source of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. Its principles include not only its maxims, but its basic notions must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical, but metaphysical knowledge, knowledge lying beyond experience. It can therefore have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psychology. It is therefore a priori knowledge, coming from pure understanding or pure reason. But so far, metaphysics, would not be distinguishable from pure mathematics. It must therefore be called pure philosophical cognition, and for the meaning of this term, I refer to the Critique of Pure Reason, Section 2, Method of Transcendentalism, Chapter 1, Section 1, Section I. Where the distinction between these two employments of the reason is sufficiently explained so far concerning the sources of metaphysical cognition. Kant's Prolegoma, concerning the kind of cognition which alone can be called metaphysical. A. Of the distinction between analytical and synthetical judgments in general. The peculiarity of its sources demands that metaphysical cognition must consist in nothing but a priori judgments. But whatever be their origin or their logical form, there is a distinction in judgments as to their content. Let me read this one more time. Of the distinction between analytical and synthetic judgments, in general, the peculiarity of its sources demands that metaphysical cognition must consist of nothing but a priori judgments. But whatever be their origin or their logical form, there is a distinction in judgments as to their content, according to which they are either merely explicative, adding nothing to the content of their cognition, or expansive, increasing the given cognition. The former may be called analytical, the latter synthetical judgments. Analytical judgments express nothing in the predicate but what has already been actually thought in the concept of the subject, though not so distinctly or with the same full consciousness. When I say all bodies are extended, I have not amplified in the least my concept of body, but have only analyzed it, as extension was really thought to belong to that concept before the judgment was made. Though it was not expressed, this judgment is therefore analytical. On the contrary, this judgment, all bodies have weight, contains in its predicate something not actually thought in the general concept of the body. It amplifies my knowledge by adding something to my concept, and must therefore be called synthetical. B. The common principle of all analytical judgments is the law of contradiction. All analytical judgments depend wholly on the law of contradiction, and are in their nature a priori cognitions. whether the concepts that supply them with matter be empirical or not, for the predicate of an affirmative analytical judgment is already contained in the concept of the subject, of which it cannot be denied without contradiction. In the same way, its opposite is necessarily denied of the subject in an analytical but negative judgment. By the same law of contradiction, such is the nature of the judgments. All bodies are extended, and no bodies are unextended. For this very reason, all analytical judgments are a priori, given when the concepts are empirical, as, for example, gold is yellow metal. For to know this, I require no experience beyond the concept of gold as a yellow metal. It is, in fact, the very concept, and I need only analyze it without looking beyond it elsewhere. C. Synthetical judgments require a different principle from the law of contradiction. There are synthetical a posteriori judgments of empirical origin, but there are also others which are proved to be certain a priori, and which spring from pure understanding and reason. Yet they both agree with this, that they cannot possibly spring from the principle of analysis. The law of contradiction alone, they require a quite different principle, though from whatever they may be deduced, they must be subject to the law of contradiction, which must never be violated, even though everything cannot be deduced from it. I shall firstly classify synthetical judgments. 1. Empirical judgments are always synthetical, for it would be absurd to base an analytical judgment on experience, as this as our concepts. For it would be absurd to base on analytical judgments on experience, as for concepts suffice for the purpose without requiring any testimony from experience. That body is extended is a judgment established a priori and not an empirical judgment. For before appealing to experience, we already have all the conditions of the judgments in the concept from which we have but to elicit the predicate according to the law of contradiction, and thereby to become conscious of the necessity of the judgment, which experience could not even teach us. 2. Mathematical judgments are all synthetical. This fact seems hitherto to have altogether escaped the observation of those who have analyzed human reason. It even seems directly opposed to all their conjectures, though incontestably certain, and most importantly in this consequence, for as it was found that the conclusion of mathematicians all proceeded accordingly to the law of contradiction, as is demanded by all apodictic certainty, men persuaded themselves that the fundamental principles were known from the same law. This was a great mistake, for a synthetical proposition can indeed be comprehended according to the law of contradiction, but only by presupposing another synthetical proposition from which it follows, but never in itself. First of all, we must observe that all proper mathematical judgments are a priori and not empirical, because they carry with them necessity, which cannot be obtained from experience. But if this be not conceded to be very good, I shall confine my assertion to pure mathematics, the very notion of which implies that it contains pure a priori and not empirical cognitions. It might at first be thought that the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a mere analytical judgment, following the concept of the sum of 7 and 5, according to the law of contradiction. But on closer examination, it appears that the concept of the sum 7 plus 5 contains merely their union on a single number, without its being at all taught what the particular number is that unites them. The concept of 12 is by no means thought by merely thinking of the combination of 7 and 5, and analyze this possible sum as we may, we shall not discover 12 in the concept. We must go beyond these concepts by calling to our aid some concrete image, Anschauung, i.e. either our 5 fingers or 5 points, as Sanger has it in his arithmetic, and we must add successively the units of 5 given in some concrete image to the concept of 7. Hence, our concept is really amplified by the proposition of 7 plus 5 equals 12. And we add to the first and second, not thought in it, arithmetical judgments are therefore synthetical, and the more plainly according as we take larger numbers, for in such cases it is clear that however closely we analyze our concepts without calling visual images outshone to our aid, we can never find a sum by such mere dissection. All principles of geometry are no less analytical. That a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points is a synthetical proposition. For my concept of straight contains nothing of quantity, but only of quality. The attribute of shortness is therefore altogether additional and cannot be obtained by an analysis of the concept. Here too, visualization and Anschauung must come to aid us. It alone makes the synthetic possible. Some other principles assumed by geometers are indeed actually analytical and depend on the law of contradiction, but they only serve as identical propositions, as a method of concatenation, and not as principles. For example, A equals A, the whole is equal to itself, or A plus B is greater than A. The whole is greater than its parts, and yet even these, though they are recognized as valid for mere concepts, are only admitted in mathematics because they can be represented in some visual form, Anschauung. What usually makes us believe that the predicate of such apodictic judgments is already contained in our concepts, and that the judgment is therefore analytical, is the duplicity of the expression requesting us to think a certain predicate as a necessity implied in the thought of a given concept, which necessity attaches to the concept. But the question is not what we are requested to join in thought to the given concepts, but what we actually think together with it, with and in it. Though obscurely, and so it appears that the predicate belongs to these concepts necessarily indeed, yet not directly but indirectly by an added visualization. Now we have 2 stars here. Okay, so we'll probably read up to page 42, 2 more pages. The essential and distinguishing feature of pure mathematical cognition among all other a priori cognitions is that it cannot at all proceed from concepts, but only by means of the construction of concepts. See the method of transcendentalism. As therefore in its judgments, it must proceed beyond the concept to that which its corresponding visualization Anschauung contains. These judgments neither can nor ought to arise analytically by dissecting the concept, but are all synthetical. I cannot refrain from pointing out to the disadvantage resulting to philosophy from the neglect of these easy and apparently insignificant observations. Hume being prompted to ask worthy of a philosopher, to cast his eye over the whole field of a priori cognitions in which human understanding claims such mighty possessions, heedlessly severed from it a whole and indeed its most valuable province, pure mathematics. For he thought its nature, or so to speak, the state constitution of this empire depended on totally different principles, namely on the law of contradiction alone. And although he did not divide judgments in this manner formally and universally, as I have done here, what he said was equivalent to this, that mathematics contains only analytical, but metaphysics, synthetical a priori judgments. In this, however, he was greatly mistaken, and the mistake had a decidedly injurious effect upon the whole conception. But for this he would have extended his question concerning the origin of our synthetical judgments far beyond the metaphysical concept of causality, and included in it the possibility of mathematics a priori also. For this latter he would have assumed to be equally synthetical, and then he could not have based his metaphysical judgments on mere experience without subjecting the axiom of mathematics equally to experience, a thing which he was far too acute to do. The good company into which metaphysics would have thus been brought would have saved it from the danger of contemptuous ill-treatment, for the thrust intended for it must have reached mathematics, which was not and could not have been Hume's intention. Thus that acute man would have been led into consideration which must needs be similar to those that now occupy us, but which would have gained inestimably by its inimitable elegant style. Metaphysical judgments, properly so called, are all synthetical. We must distinguish judgments pertaining to metaphysics from metaphysical judgments properly so called. Many of the former are analytical, but they only afford the means of metaphysical judgments, which are the whole end of the science, and which are always synthetical. For if there be concepts pertaining to metaphysics, as for example that of substance, the judgments springing from simple analysis of them also pertain to metaphysics. As for example, substance is that which only exists as subject, and by means of several such analytical judgments we seek to approach the definition of the concept. But as the analysis of a pure concept of the understanding pertaining to metaphysics does not proceed in any different manner from the dissection of any other, even empirical concepts not pertaining to metaphysics, such as air in the elastic fluid, the elasticity of which is not destroyed by any known degree of cold, it follows that the concept indeed, but not the analytical judgment, is properly metaphysical. This science has something peculiar in the production of its a priori cognitions, which must therefore be distinguished from the features it has in common with other rational knowledge. Thus the judgment that all the substance in things is permanent is a synthetical and properly metaphysical judgment. If the a priori principles which constitute the materials of metaphysics have first been collected according to fixed principles, then their analysis will be of great value. It might be thought as a particular part of Philosophia Definitiva, containing nothing but analytical judgments pertaining to metaphysics, and could be treated separately from the synthetical which constitute metaphysics proper. For indeed these analyses are not elsewhere of much value, except in metaphysics, as regards the synthetical judgments which are to be generated by these previously analyzed concepts. The conclusion drawn in this section, then, is that metaphysics is properly concerned with synthetical propositions a priori, and these alone constitute its end, for which it indeed requires various dissections of its concepts, vis-a-vis of its analytical, of its analytical judgments, but wherein the procedure is not different from that in every other kind of knowledge, but which merely seek to render our concepts distinct by analysis. But the generation of a priori cognition by concrete images, as well as by its concepts, is in fine of synthetical proposition a priori in philosophical cognition constitutes the essential subject of metaphysics. The term apodictic is borrowed by Kant from Aristotle, who uses it in the sense of certainty beyond dispute. The word is derived from apodicten, I show, and is contrasted to dialectical propositions, i.e. such statements admit of controversy. Okay. Let's just read here. 3. A remark on the general division of judgments into analytic and synthetic. The division is indispensable as concerns the critique of human understanding, and therefore deserves to be called classical, though otherwise it is of little use. But this is the reason why dogmatic philosophers who always seek the sources of metaphysical judgments in metaphysics itself, and not apart from it. The pure laws of reason generally altogether neglected this apparently obvious distinction. Thus the celebrated Wolff and his acute followers Baumgarten came to seek the proof of principle of sufficient reason, which is clearly synthetical, in the principle of contradiction. In Locke's essay, however, I find an indication of my division. For in the fourth book, chapter 3, 9, having discussed the various connections of representations and judgment and their sources, one of which he makes identity and contradiction, and another the coexistence of representations in a subject, he confesses that our a priori knowledge of the latter is very narrow and almost nothing. But in his remarks on the species of cognition, there is so little of what is definite and reduced to rules that we cannot wonder if no one, not even Hume, was led to make investigations concerning this sort of judgment. For such general and yet definite principles are not easily learned from other men who have had them obscurely in their minds. We must hit on them first by our own reflection. Then we find them elsewhere, where we could not possibly have found them at first, because the authors themselves did not know that such an idea lay at the basis of their observations. Men who never think independently have nevertheless the acuteness to discover everything after it has been once shown them in what was said long since, though no one ever saw it there before. So 4. The general question of the Prolegoma: is metaphysics at all possible? Yeah, we'll read that. It's not that long. Were a metaphysics which could maintain its place as a science really in existence, could we say, here is metaphysics, learn it and it will convince you irresistibly and irrevocably of its truth? This question would be useless, and there would only remain that other question, which would rather be a test of our acuteness than a proof of the existence of the thing in itself. How is the science possible? How does reason come to attain it? But human reason has not yet been the fortunate in this case. There is no single book to which you can point, as you do to Euclid and say, this is metaphysics. Here you may find the noblest objects of this science, the knowledge of the highest being, and of a future existence proved from principles of pure reason. We can be shown, indeed, many judgments demonstrably certain and never questioned, but these are all analytical and rather concern the material and the scaffolding for metaphysics than the extension of knowledge, which is our proper object in studying it. Even supposing you produce synthetical judgments, such as the law of sufficient reason, which you have never proved, as you ought to, from pure reason a priori, though we gladly concede its truth, you lapse when they come to be employed for your principal object into such doubtful assertions that in all ages one metaphysics has contradicted another either in its assertions or their proofs, and thus has itself destroyed its own claim to lasting assent. Nay, the very attempt to set up such a science are the main causes of the early appearance of skepticism, a mental attitude in which reason treats itself with such violence that it could never have arisen save from complete despair of ever satisfying our most important aspirations. For long before men began to inquire into nature methodologically, they constituted abstract reason, which had to some extent been exercised by means of ordinary experience. For reason is ever present, while laws of nature must usually be discovered with labor. So metaphysics floated to the surface like foam, which dissolved the moment it was scooped off. But immediately there appeared a new supply on the surface, to be ever eagerly gathered up by some, while others, instead of seeking in the depths the cause of the phenomena, thought they showed their wisdom by ridiculing the idle labor of their neighbor. Weary, therefore, as well as dogmatism, which teaches us nothing, as of skepticism, which does not even promise us anything, not even the quiet state of a contented ignorance, disquieted by the importance of knowledge, so much needed, and lastly, rendered suspicious by long experience of all knowledge which we believe we possess, or which offers itself under the title of pure reason. There remains but one critical question on the answer to which our future procedure depends, vis-a-vis, is metaphysics at all possible? But this question must be answered not by skeptical objections to the asservations of some actual system of metaphysics. For we do not as yet admit such a thing to exist, but from the conception, as yet only problematical, of a science of the sort. In the Critique of Pure Reason, I have treated this question synthetically by making inquiries into pure reason itself, and endeavoring in this source to determine the elements as well as the laws of its pure use according to principles. The task is difficult and requires a resolute reader to penetrate by degrees into a system based on no data except reason itself, and which therefore seeks, without resting upon any fact, to unfold knowledge of its original germs. Prolegoma, however, are designed for preparatory exercise. They are intended rather to point out what we have to do in order, if possible, to actualize a science than to propound it. They must therefore rest upon something already known as trustworthy, from which we can set out with confidence and ascend to sources as yet unknown, the discovery of which will not only explain to us what we knew, but exhibit a sphere of many cognitions which all spring from the same source. The method of Prolegoma, especially of those designed as a preparation for future metaphysics, is consequently analytical. But it happens, unfortunately, that though we cannot assume metaphysics to be an actual science, we can say with confidence that certain pure a priori synthetical cognitions, pure mathematics, and pure physics are actual and given, for both contain propositions which are thoroughly recognized as apodictically certain, partly by mere reason, partly by general consent arising from experience, and yet as independent of experience. We have therefore some at least uncontested synthetical knowledge, a priori, and need not ask whether it be possible, for it is actual. But how is it possible, in order that we may deduce from the principles which make the given cognitions possible the possibility of all the rest? So we've read some Prolegoma. There's still a good amount of way to go in it. See, in this book, they actually haven't chopped up the chapters of Kant's Prolegoma itself. The book is a chapter in its whole. So let's just see a few things here in this book. We've read 1, we've read 2, we've definitely read 3 and 4. Yeah. So the next time we're here, we will be on the general problem of how is cognition of pure reason possible. But let's see how many times the name Hume is mentioned in this book. So 805 times the book is mentioned. And a lot of that time is from the secondary literature. So Kant, I don't think he mentions him, that much. I'd say maximum 100 times. Because here is the beginning of the Prolegoma, which is on page 36. And it goes up to page 146. And if we look, a lot of dimensions of Hume are beyond this. So if you see, in the sides on the right-hand side, where my mouse is, up here is where Kant's Prolegoma starts, and down here is where it ends. So Kant is probably saying Hume in his text 100 times. But in here, and below, Hume is all over the place, which is great, because it's a very detailed discussion that's going on here. There is disagreement among Hume scholars as to what Hume's view on causality actually is. And There is also disagreement among Kant and Hume scholars as to what the debate is over. So we'll be reading some of these papers, and maybe all of these papers, to see who's correct or who's closest to the truth. So that is the reading for today. I hope you have a great day, and next time we'll continue with the Prolegoma. Take care.